Today is March 31st, 2019. My name is Travis Burt, and I'm interviewing Renato Ramirez for the Voces Oral History Project. We are sitting in Corpus Christi, Texas. Mr. Ramirez, thank you for sharing your perspective with us. As we have already explained, your interview will be housed at the Natty Lee Benson Latin American History Collection. Please know that if there's anything you do not want to talk about, you do not have to, and if there's anything you do want to talk about and that I don't ask about, please feel free to interject. Okay, let's get started. So to start off, tell me about growing up in San Diego, Texas.
Well, it was a small town, probably about 3,000 people at the time. We were all born in our house, okay, no hospital. I saw my baby brother birth, at the hands of our doctor who was delivering the baby in our home. It was a very poor community, predominantly Mexican American. I'd say 95% at least. Those that weren't embraced the culture very quickly, and most of the families in San Diego are what are described as land grant families. Okay, they go back to the early settlement of the region, and their ancestors had ownership of land grants from Spain and from Mexico in this area, okay? And so there's a lot of families that know each other very closely, and many of them are related to each other over several generations, for people that live in San Diego. San Diego is a very old community, okay? It was the first Roman Catholic diocese recognized south of San Antonio, okay, even before Laredo. So that gives testament to its roots and to its long history. And I really enjoyed growing up there, being a small town and everyone is close-knit. By the time I was 6 years old, I was roaming the streets throughout the city, barefoot, doing whatever I wanted a lot of times. And it was common for most kids growing up back then doing that, and everyone knew you, okay? They'd always recognize you by your parents, and they'd point you out. By the time I was 6 years old, I was shining shoes downtown in San Diego, on the main drag, and after each payday, gentlemen would go into town, do a little bit of shopping, get their mail, and get the gossip of the week, and that was a good time to go in and shine boots and shoes of people. My brother and my father built us a shoe shine kit, and taught us how to shine shoes, bought us some brushes and some cloths and some wax, and he took one side of Main Street and I took the other side, and then we'd alternate every week, and my father ran the projector at the local theater, okay? And so he was very well known as well. He was also a member of the City League semi-pro baseball teams dating back to the 1930s. And that was a very popular sport, and teams from outside of the region of the Negro League would come in during the season and hold tournaments against the Hispanic semi-pro baseball teams during that time period, from the 1930s, 1920s, and onwards, And then the war disrupted all that, and I wasn't born until 1953, but everyone knows the history of it, because growing up, you'd meet all these older folks, and they'd tell you about it. It was common lore to speak about the history of San Diego. And San Diego is also famous for being very political. A man named George Parr and his family, Archer Parr was his father, they built up a political machine in Duval County that dominated South Texas politics for the Democratic Party up until the 1970s. from the 1920s to the 1970s, okay? And the Parr family served in the state legislature. They were county judges, they were landowners, major landowners, and they basically determined who had political influence in the entire county. They would select the county sheriff, the school board, superintendent, judges, so forth. If they had their blessing, then they could run for office. If they didn't, more than likely they weren't going to succeed, you know. But it's a very storied history in San Diego, and I really appreciated growing up there. I only lived there from birth till 10 years old. From there, at 10, I moved to Alice, Texas, just 10 miles away. And Alice was a much different environment. It was a biracial, bicultural, bilingual city, okay? 6 times the size of San Diego. And you had families divided by a railroad track on Highway 44. And on the south side of the track, you had Hispanic and African American families. And on the north side of the track, you had Anglo white families. And generally, they didn't associate very much until they got into high school, you know. But in the 1960s, that sort of started to break down. The passage of civil rights legislation spurred a lot of change. At the same time, the cultural changes that were going on with young people, this is when I was a teenager, led to a defrosting of this segregation that existed, okay? Our commonality in growing long hair, in listening to rock and roll, in smoking pot, things of that sort, you know, became sort of like a unifying force, okay? White kids wanted to smoke pot too, they just didn't know where to get it. We wanted to sell pot, so we sold it to them, and we sort of bridged the gap to some extent, you know. And, you know, it may sound a bit criminal, but that's the way life was, you know, back then, and it was absolutely fantastic, you know.
So what was it like going to school when you were growing up, both in Alice and San Diego?
I started in, I went to kindergarten, first and second grade, to parochial school, Catholic school. And in the second grade, they had to close it down, okay, because of a lack of funding, okay. And at that time, I was an altar boy as well, okay. So I went into the public schools from third grade and fourth grade in San Diego. Then when I got to Alice, it was fifth grade on until graduation. In San Diego, it was great. By the time I was in second, third grade, I was already playing hooky and getting in trouble for it. But I learned well, you know. And in Alice, when I got to school there, they sort of, because I came from a small school that was predominantly Hispanic, they put me with the slow group, you know, in school. And in that group, I excelled, you know. By the time I got to junior high, this is the time that the schools were having to desegregate in order to mix both Hispanic, black, and white kids together in the classroom. The junior high that I went to did this by putting one Hispanic in every classroom that was predominantly white. And I tended to be that student at times. I remember a couple of times, at least 2 or 3 classes that I was in where all my classmates were Anglo students, okay? And I was the only Hispanic. And because we're in South Texas and there's a lot of Spanish and Mexican history associated with the area, I was often called upon in class to translate, okay? What does the Nueces River mean, for example? You know, and I'd say, well, it means pecans, you know. What does the word Alamo mean? And that means a cottonwood tree, you know, things of that sort. So I was appreciated at the same time, but I sort of understood that I was being singled out to, you know, ensure compliance with the policy in a very underhanded way, you know. But I was heavily involved in sports. You know, I ran track. I was a place kicker at one time in junior high, but I played basketball in the varsity team for 2.5 years, and I thought I was real good. I was also politically involved. At the time, we enjoyed the idea of growing long hair, wearing bell bottoms. Girls wanted to be able to wear pants. They didn't let them. Guys had to have their hair cropped real short. We were also in the middle of the Vietnam War, and we had a military draft going on, and a lot of us understood that as soon as we graduate, we're going to be drafted, and go fight if the war continues. So there was a strong anti-war movement among students. We wore patches and armbands as a moratorium against the Vietnam War. This was a national movement, okay? And we conducted walkouts and sit-ins. I helped organize some. And I remember reading Saul Alinsky, Rules for Radicals, when I was when I was in high school, a sophomore, and I started to use some of the ideas and principles that he developed for civil disobedience, and became pretty effective. I helped publish a school newspaper that wasn't sanctioned by the school, that criticized the administration, that criticized the policies of the school board, and it got people in trouble. But at the same time, it forced the school board and the administration to pay attention to us. And so we were willing to get in trouble so long as we could get an ear from the people in power. And eventually things changed. So that student activism that began was really effective in the long run, and it brought a lot of different disparate groups together, for the same common goals of more freedom, more justice, so forth. Really enjoyed it. And I did pretty well in school. I mean, I consider myself maybe a low B student, but in my aptitude exams, I excelled, and I ended up taking the ACT test, and I scored in the mid-20s, which was pretty unheard of for a Hispanic kid, and I aced the English portion of it to the point that I was offered scholarships to come in with all my English credits completed. Okay, I'll have to, at least the freshman grammar and composition parts and so forth. So that was good. I ended up going to Pan American University in Edinburgh right after high school, and then eventually transferred to Texas A&I Kingsville, so that was my schooling to some extent.
So, kind of shifting focus, tell me a little bit about your family. What was, say, your father like? Start there.
My father was a tough man. He had a third grade education, dropped out because he had to go to work. He was also being made fun of because of his clothing, lack of clothing. But by the time he was 10 years old, he was dropped out of school and working and trying to make ends meet. His mother took in orphans as they grew up, and she raised them to adulthood. She was also a folk healer to some extent. People went to her for folklorish remedies when they became ill. And I remember being treated with folklore remedies, a broom, an egg, drinking tea from roots and different plants and so forth, to cure me of nightmares, to cure me of fevers that I couldn't overcome, to cure me of fright, to cure me of anger, things of that sort as a young boy. And I'd always tell my mother, "Look, Mom, I don't believe in voodoo." And she'd tell me, "Shut up and take it," And but my father, worked, once he got a job at the base here in Corpus Christi. We were still living in San Diego. That's 70 miles away. That's at least an hour and a half, almost 2 hours of driving. To be here at 7 in the morning to work, they'd have to wake up at 4 in the morning every morning. leave by 5 o'clock, actually leave by 4:30 to make it on time for work. So he got home from work at about 6:30, had supper, went to bed, woke up at 4:30 in the morning, then went to work. I'd see him on the weekends, for the most part. But he was a war hero, in my view. He fought in World War II in the Rhineland. His two brothers were also World War II veterans. His father was a World War I veteran. They led very hard lives. He grew up he was born in 1914. By the time he was a young man, the Great Depression hit. He joined the Civilian Conservation Corps and traveled from South Texas all the way to California and joined the military while he was over there. He got married to my mother right before he shipped out to Europe, okay? And even at work at the base, when during the Vietnam War, I remember they worked on lockdown. Nobody could go in, nobody could leave the base. And so they would work 18 hours a day, sleep in the barracks, and then wake up and work again, repairing helicopters being used for the Vietnam War. One day, that was for the U.S. Army, okay? There's two employers at the base. You had the Army and the Navy back in the 1960s. And one day my father spoke up when this Inspector General from Washington, from the Defense Department, came in and inspected the base. The majority of people at work at the base are civilian, but they're ex-military. And they inspect everything. And before he leaves, he puts every person on the base in formation, military formation, okay? Including civilians. And then he asked the workforce, does anyone have anything to say to me before I leave to Washington? And my father broke rank, broke rank and raised his arm and said, look, a lot of my fellow co-workers of Mexican-American descent are World War II veterans, Korean War veterans, and even Vietnam veterans. But all they get to do is to mow the lawn or to mop floors. They're either custodial or housekeeping jobs that they get, even though they had technical skills. So we'd like to see more promotions for Hispanics here at the base based on the experience and their service that they've given to the country, And the Inspector General said, well, okay, I'll take that into consideration. And my father that day was called into the headquarters for the U.S. Army and was fired for speaking out, okay? That same afternoon, the Navy called him into their headquarters and hired him, okay? So, and he never said anything to us as children. We just had to, our mom was the one that communicated with us. Our father basically repressed and suppressed everything, but I heard that from fellow co-workers of his many years later who found out, oh, you're Mac's son. Well, your father is a great man. He made it possible for for me to be promoted at work and so forth. And so I felt very proud about him. I just never communicated very much with him, But that was growing up with my dad. He was a real tough man. Like I said, he used to run the theater in San Diego. This is in the 1930s and 1940s. After the movie was over, they would actually create a makeshift boxing ring and have boxing matches, okay, for the public to watch. And my father was one of the boxers. And according to my uncle, he was a pretty good boxer, So, that was growing up with my dad like that,
What was your mother like?
She was very sweet, very kind. She loved her kids. She was born on a ranch in 1923. She was 10 years younger than my father, okay, about 11 years younger. She actually did graduate from high school in 1942, I think, in San Diego, Texas. She would do anything for her children, and she was an excellent cook and an excellent mother, caretaker, so forth. She was very docile and submissive to my father, okay? Whatever my father said went a lot of times, but my mother would actually, go against his wishes a lot of times without him knowing. She would simply say, just don't let him know, So, and I think it was pretty common back then for marriages to be that way, where the woman was silent and was basically the housekeeper and caretaker of all the finances and everything, and the man simply worked and worked and worked. My dad didn't like it when she actually went to work, but she eventually got a job as a manager of a Western wear store in Alice, Texas, and started bringing in some money on her own and so forth. And it sort of created some resentment and antagonism between my mom and dad. But, we were a big family. We were a growing family. We were all born within a few years of each other. So when we started graduating, every other year somebody was graduating from high school and wanted to go to college or wanted to get a job or wanted to buy a car or get married and so forth. And that takes money, so she was a real nice lady. And she came from a very big family and a pioneer family from South Texas, dating back, I'd say about 8 generations. Right before the 1800s, they were settled in South Texas, right along the border, okay, and then eventually inland as well.
So, with higher education, were you encouraged by your parents or teachers to go pursue higher education?
The teachers know, we still had a system back in the early 70s where if you didn't finish in the top 2 or 3 people, valedictorian, salutatorian, and highest grade point or whatever, class average, you generally weren't advised to do anything, I ended up going to Pan American University immediately after high school because my brother lived in Edinburgh, okay? And that's where the school's situated. And so I could room with him and his wife and saved money, okay? And I went there for about a year and a half, and I really enjoyed it because it was so separated from my parents and from the area that I grew up in. The Valley was like a different world to me, And after money got tight again, I came back to Alice and commuted from Alice to Kingsville and attended Texas A&I University. And I started in 72, and I graduated in 78. I went to work. I'd drop out at times and go to work with the phone company, during the summers and during the winters as well sometimes, in order to raise money to go back to school, And so it took me a little while to graduate, but I did graduate in 78 from Texas A&I with a double major in political science and psychology. And after that, I went to work at the Community Action Agency in Alice, Texas, doing social programs, helping the poverty population, the elderly, preschoolers, so forth, And that was really rewarding, but it was very low paying.
You seem very politically active in your youth. What led you to do that?
My father used to take me into the voting booth with him when I was a young boy. San Diego being dominated, being the central area for a political dynasty machine down in South Texas, all the politicians that ran for state office and even national office would come through San Diego to get the endorsement of the Parr family. And that meant that you'd get thousands and thousands of Democratic votes, okay? Lyndon Johnson did it going into the Senate. Herbert Walker Bush, George H.W. Bush. I remember seeing him at a political speech in San Diego back in 1960, okay? This is before he ever held political office, okay? This is the first time he was running for the Texas House of Representatives. I think it was the Texas House or the U.S. House. He was running against a man named Jack Cox, okay, C-O-X. And My dad was also, when he came back from the war in 1946, they organized a political party in San Diego in opposition to the Parr family, and it was called the Freedom Party. And these folks had their own slate of candidates running for office locally, county judge and so forth. And they were a lot of times harassed and intimidated by the Parr family. I remember as a young boy, my parents and some of their friends were meeting, having a social gathering, and the men were outside, the women were inside the house cooking, and all of a sudden these cars come in, and some of the Parr's henchmen came out and had machine guns, these Tommy guns that you'd see, back in the movies and so forth, and they told us to break it up. And they sent everybody fleeing. This is what the type of intimidation that went on a lot of times. So I grew up, he always talked about politics and so forth. As a young boy, one of the things that I got into a habit of doing was reading the newspaper during breakfast from page to page, from first page to the last page, every single word. And I remember reading an encyclopedia, the entire set of the World Book Encyclopedia, when my parents bought it back in about 1958, 59, So I was really interested in learning. And when you read a newspaper daily, you get a heavy dose of politics, okay? A lot of the front page and the first section of a newspaper is political, whether it's state, local, or national. And so you sort of begin to understand a lot of the politics. And by the time I was in the 8th grade, 12 years old, stuff like that, 13, I was already pretty well versed on political parties and so forth, and by the time I made it to high school, and we had all these social issues, cultural changes, civil rights, Vietnam, the Chicano movement, I became extremely vocal, and carried that into my teaching today, 50 years later, So it's been a natural progression for me to be politically active and to speak out, In the last few years, as the country has shifted, we go through this pendulum of liberal to conservative and back and forth, we're getting to an area where we're unable to speak with each other. There's no compromise between factions in society. The media that dominates is social media, Facebook, Twitter, and so forth. And everyone speaks without having very much knowledge a lot of times, or without much understanding of political issues. And it just creates a mess when it comes to trying to resolve and compromise and do what is right for the entire country, when there are so many that are unwilling to do that, So I've sort of scaled back my activism and focused more on just simply teaching the fundamentals of what the Constitution means, what citizenship means, what an active understanding of society means, Get back to the fundamentals that a lot of our younger generation are skipping, because social media, you get on it by the time you're 10 years old, and you don't have to listen to anyone. You can just simply listen to what is being said on the web, and you have a computer in your hand, a handheld computer, and you don't have to study. You can just Google it, and it's there. So it's created a very lazy and dangerous. It's setting a dangerous precedent for learning and for democracy as well. So I'm trying to get students to put their phones down, open up their eyes and ears, and start to read the way I used to do, the way it was traditionally done. in order to gain a firm understanding of what's being said. You get a lot more detail in reading than just simply listening or reading a post. It's very passive. That way. Go ahead.
So you mentioned the Chicano movement earlier. Tell me about your brother Adolfo's involvement with them, or with that.
Duffy was the only one of our family members, the siblings, that graduated from San Diego. He didn't have the experience that we faced in Alice, where we had this cultural divide between white and brown. Okay, so when he got to college, it was shocking for him to see it at the university level. He went to Kingsville, A&I, and so a lot of the Hispanic students that were being shunned by the fraternities and all the clubs on campus formed their own clubs and formed their own political parties, had their own homecoming queen contests, and became very politically vocal, okay? And so he was in the first generation of these, I call it the first generation of the modern Chicano movement, okay? The older Chicano movement was the founding of LULAC and the American GI Forum by veterans of World War II, okay? And some of the earlier folks. The modern Chicano power movement began in the 1960s. This was the first generation of a large number of Hispanics, men, going to college for the first time ever, okay, as a result of the GI Bill and things of that sort, and to avoid the draft in the Vietnam War, okay? And they organized and they became very politically active, and they created the Raza Unida Party, the Mexican American Youth Organization, and various groups, and my brother was heavily involved in that. He eventually graduated and moved down to the Valley. He's been there ever since. But at the Valley, this group, MAYO, Mexican American Youth Organization, was formed in 1968. Carlos Guerra, the first national president of that organization, was my brother's roommate in college. They were very, very close friends, okay? He eventually became a reporter and editorial writer for the San Antonio Express and News, okay? And he was extremely influential, very powerful as far as his speeches, very motivation. He was very good at motivating people, and he and my brother worked together in tandem for many years. My brother helped at that they held their first, Mayo held its first national convention in Mission, Texas, down in the valley at La Lomita Monastery, okay? This is the monastery that's currently being challenging President Trump's wall, okay, because it goes right through their property. And that was the home of the Mayo Convention in 1968. At that convention, they decided that one of the ways of helping the Hispanic population was to create a university based on a Hispanic curriculum, okay? Instead of one that was European ethnocentric, okay, Anglocentric. And it was a very ambitious undertaking, but it actually worked. They aligned themselves with Antioch University out of Dayton, Ohio, okay, Yellow Springs, Ohio, and got funded as a graduate center. So you had graduate students enrolled under Antioch at the Colegio Jacinto Trevino Center down in the valley. And they were pursuing a master's degree in teaching, an MAT, Master of Arts in Teaching. And to do that, they had to create a curriculum, create a registrar's office, have a library, have courses and professors, and then get students to enroll. And they did it. They did it for about 5-6 years. Then they moved from, at least a portion of that university moved to Austin on St. Edward's University. They took over the top floor of the castle of St. Edward's, and organized Juarez Lincoln University, named after Abraham Lincoln and Benito Juarez, both liberators of their respective countries. Okay, and it was called a university without walls. Okay, the professors would go out into the field and bring education to folks that couldn't make it to the college, but they did have a central campus, you know. And I brought some photos to that show that, and that lasted up until about 1980. They graduated, I would assume, about 400, 500 people with master's degrees in teaching. One of their graduates was actually Leonard Nimoy, Captain Mr. Spock of Star Trek. Okay, but their primary focus was on helping migrant laborers. Okay, and they tried their best to get students that would drop out and fall through the cracks of the system to complete their schooling and help themselves professionally. You know, and it was, like I said, a very noble cause, but everywhere they went, there was a lot of opposition by people that didn't understand what they were doing. And there was also a lot of internal conflict as well among the personnel there. But I'm really proud of what he did, you know.
So after you graduated college, what did you go on to do?
Like I said, I worked for a local agency that received federal funds, federal grants. It was called the Community Action Corporation of South Texas. Okay, community action programs were part of the Great Society programs of Lyndon Johnson of the 1960s. The idea of community action was that you would apply for federal funds, and based on proposals that you did locally, describing how you were going to use those monies. Okay, and so these CAP programs, community action programs, were created all over the country. Okay, every region of the country had a community action program, and they received funding based on what their ideas of using those funds were. Okay, we provided services for the elderly, shut-ins, Meals on Wheels. We had the Job Corps. We had Head Start programs. You've heard of these programs. Head Start for low-income preschoolers. We did dental screenings, medical screenings. We bought kitchens and created cafeterias. We bought classrooms and filled them with teachers and equipment. It was my job to come up with ideas of what to do. That was part of my job, you know. And I would also hire folks to work in these different programs that we organized and got funded. And I'm still sort of associated with them to some extent, okay? I've never forgotten my service there, even though I only worked there for about 2.5 years. You know, it was really influential. But like I said, even though it was very rewarding, you know, spiritually and culturally, it was very low paid. And Ronald Reagan, when he was elected in 1981, started slashing social service programs left and right. And instead of helping increase funding for these type of programs, he slashed them. And as a result, many of these programs were reduced in scope, and pay for employers was cut as well. And so I left that, got into the oil field in Alice, Texas, delivering oil field parts to drilling rigs throughout the south of San Antonio, into the King Ranch and down to the valley to Laredo, places like that. Then in 1982, after a couple of years of doing that, I joined the U.S. Army, and I went to basic training in El Paso, Fort Bliss. Then from there, I went to my specialization training. That was at Redstone Arsenal, Huntsville, Alabama. And from there, I went to Europe for about 4 years. And I worked on missile fire control systems. Okay. All the fire controls are the radars and the buttons that say fire and so forth, all the launchers and such. And so it was a pretty extensive type of training that I went through, and really enjoyed my service in the military as well. You know, gave me a different perspective. Finally got to leave Texas, South Texas, for the first time ever, and went to Europe. Went to while over there, even though I was stationed in Germany, I actually trained in the island of Crete in the middle of the Mediterranean. I trained in Italy. I went to Spain, Austria, France, Denmark as well. So I got to travel quite a bit, you know. And I actually did a real good job in what I was trained to do. You know, I received some commendations for that.
So how do you think your foreign service impacted your life, like as a whole, the way you think and whatnot?
Before I joined the military, I was sort of lost. I was partying a lot. I was still relatively young. I was still in my 20s. And I was bouncing from job to job, you know. I also served, I also worked at a diesel mechanics shop. I also installed burglar alarms and air conditioners and things of that sort. I was a baker at a Winchell's donut shop, okay? I'd go in at 11 at night and work all night baking donuts and fritters and all sorts of stuff, and then have it ready for opening at 5 a.m. every morning. So I was bouncing around from one job to another without any direction. My brother had just died in 1978, my youngest brother, and it was I had a difficult time dealing with it. The woman I thought I was going to marry at one point, we broke up. She ended up marrying someone else, and so I didn't have anything holding me here. And so I joined the military. I also wanted some payback against Reagan for his cut-in of our programs, and I felt that if I go into the military and spread a little bit of my activism, I might be able to get an ounce of revenge. But that's what it spurred me to go. There were a lot of things happening locally, with me trying to find my way around and get away from folks that I didn't want to be with anymore, and just fall into a new setting. And so, I joined the military. I already had a degree when I joined, but I didn't go into the officers' corps. I went enlisted based on the advice that my father gave me, and I really enjoyed it. Had a great time.
Okay. And how do you think your service affected your political views? Do you think it did?
It made me more regimented in my thought, okay? I'm more, prior to the military, I was very sort of wishy-washy and very easily convinced to do one thing or another by others. After I left the military, I was a platoon leader, I was a squad leader, I was looked up to by a lot of younger soldiers. I actually excelled quite a bit. And so when I came out, I became much more decisive in my decision making and in what I believed in. And it didn't change my politics or anything. I'm still considered myself a liberal Democrat, okay? And I always will. I'm never going to forsake that party unless they forsake their values, But it just made me more capable of communicating my views and being direct and not just that, but just I'm no longer a pushover or someone that is easily intimidated. I began to speak my mind a lot more. And that helped. That idea of discipline, became very instilled. Military bearing, what they refer to, and I became much more I acknowledged right from wrong much more strongly, okay, and I became a better person, okay, in trying to do what is right and what I consider right,
So after you left the military, what did you go on to do?
Well, I left the military because my sister got sick, okay? I didn't plan to leave the military, but my younger sister, Madeline, developed ovarian cancer after having given birth to a child, and her husband left her. Her husband used to beat her up, trying to force her to have a miscarriage, But I dedicated myself to her. My parents couldn't help her. They were pretty old already. This was the mid-'80s. And so I left the military to take care of my sister. I took her to chemotherapy. I took her to radiation therapy at MD Anderson. She went into remission for a few years. Then the cancer came back and killed her in 1989. Okay. During that time, I dedicated myself to her. But I also joined the active Army Reserve in order to make money. And I began teaching as a substitute teacher in the public school system in Alice. And then I went to graduate school to get a master's degree while all this was going on with my sister, And the same year she died is when I was hired to teach at Del Mar College. And I've been there ever since. I did teach for a couple of semesters at A&I Kingsville, right at the time that Texas A&M took over, okay? I was there at the transition from A&I used to be part of what was called the University of South Texas system. It was Texas A&I, Pan American, Laredo State University, and Texas Southmost in Brownsville. Now they're part of the A&M system. One college out of about 15. They don't have any influence. Okay. When they were a single university system, they had influence because everything that they wanted pertained to South Texas education. The A&M system is centered, and this goes for the UT system as well. You're either in Austin or in College Station, and you try to bring the money there, okay? These other satellite campuses will have to do with less, okay? All the colleges under the South Texas Border Initiative, A&M adopted Kingsville and Corpus, UT adopted Pan American and Brownsville. But they were the only schools in the entire UT system and in the entire A&M system that were not able to tap into the Permanent University Fund, okay? They are the only schools that are not given access to that, or at least originally, okay? And so they just basically took us, gave us their name, but didn't give us anything, okay? If you wanted money, you had to go petition on your own over in Austin. And they're not going to pay attention to you if you're just a small cog out of the bigger machine over in Austin or in College Station. So it was a struggle to get law school. Well, we don't have a law school south of San Antonio, still. That's the largest area in the entire country not serviced by a law school. We just got a medical school a couple of years ago down in the valley. I don't believe they've graduated their first class yet, okay? Up until then, this was the largest area in the entire country without a medical school, okay? South Texas historically was seen as a place of menial labor, okay? You want people to work in the oil fields, you want people to pick crops, go to South Texas, okay? You want doctors and nurses and engineers and so forth, go to Austin, go to Houston, okay? So whenever our students from here ended up going to Austin or to College Station or to San Antonio, generally they didn't come back. It was created a brain drain, okay? The best and the brightest go elsewhere for a quality education and then realize that there's a much better world outside of South Texas. They don't come back, okay? And so that just perpetuates this decay and, lack of quality when it comes to education down here. these colleges and universities here are generally considered third and fourth class colleges and universities. They don't have comprehensive graduate and doctoral programs. They're not research institutes for the most part, okay? Even though that's slowly changing. But it's taken years and years of litigation and protest in order to get them. And generally it's a lawsuit that forces them to pay attention. Anything short of a lawsuit, they just simply give you lip service, okay? And it was that lawsuit of Lulac versus Richards in the mid-'80s that forced UT and A&M to adopt us all of a sudden, okay? We had been here forever. They had never given us any attention whatsoever, but when we filed a lawsuit and won, all of a sudden they say, hey, look at these schools. If we want to diversify our enrollment, there's a whole bunch of Mexicans south of San Antonio. We can get them in our school without having to give them programs and get the federal government off our back, okay? So that essentially is what happened, okay? And little by little, it's been 30, 40, almost 40 years since then, okay? We're slowly starting to make progress as far as expanded programs, okay? But it's not, every step of the way you have to fight for it in order to get these type of programs because they're unwilling to share their resources, their money, and their expertise in these areas a lot of times. So we're still sort of a backwater area of education in the entire state.
So, given that, what's it been like for you personally teaching at Del Mar?
Oh, I love it. I teach everything that I've talked about. I generally teach a lot of times, okay? So that a lot of my students, as a matter of fact, it's been, I've noticed this over the 30 years that I've been teaching, white students don't register for my class unless I'm the only instructor available, okay? Hispanic students will register because they generally see some sort of cultural identity. But for white students to register in my class, I think they assume that they're getting a lower quality education or one that doesn't jive with their preset notions of what society is, okay? And justice is and so forth, I never say that in class, but it's something that I've noticed over the years, over the decades that I've taught, okay? And I've actually heard students comment on that, and it's terrible to hear as a professional educator, but I think it's common, okay? It's just never spoken out loud, okay? It's something that is repressed. And, white kids, when they get together, they'll talk about it. Hispanic kids, when they get together, they'll talk about it. But in public, for everyone's consumption, they don't, okay? I do my best. Like I said, I've been teaching the fundamentals of the Constitution, what our society is about, the history. I use a lot of history in my political science course, okay? I think history and government go hand in hand. They complement each other, and, our political history is a mirror of our society, okay? So, I've been told by students afterward that, and sometimes many years afterwards, that I really enjoyed your class. You really opened my eyes and things of that sort. I've had several students that have become lawyers that have gone on to law school and have gone on to professional careers that have been great, So I like that a lot, and I felt really lucky to get into teaching, It's rare that, the number of faculty in colleges and universities that are of Hispanic background is probably still less than 4 or 5% throughout the entire country. Now in South Texas, you might have a higher percentage because there's a higher concentration of people. But if you balance it out throughout the entire country, it's still, for a population that makes up 20% of the population in the United States, they only have about 5% of the educators, maybe even less, much less probably. I'm in a unique situation to help students understand their background, understand society, understand their rights, understand politics, And I want people to do that. And it takes experience, varied experience, to be able to express what goes on in society. And I think I have a very varied background, very many different experiences, and I've got a very good memory of the history of my family and so forth, and all our social, political activities that we underwent, experienced growing up. And I use that to help teach, and I think I've done a good job of it, at the college where I'm at. One thing that I sort of resented was not being able to go to a doctoral program at the time. When I left the military and I went to graduate school, I was still dealing with the issue of my sister having cancer, then her death, and then my parents getting old, and I just never married, and so many family issues came up that I just dedicated to helping them as much as I could, and develop a career. And everything else I didn't bother with it. But I never liked the idea of not having doctoral programs down here in South Texas, because I shouldn't have to pull up my roots and leave this area to get a quality education. I have my parents buried here. My brother and sister are buried here. All my relatives are buried here. And I've contributed to this society as a taxpayer, as a soldier, as an educated citizen. I shouldn't have to be able to pull my roots up and abandon them and take off to an area that generally doesn't want me, in order to get an education. So I remember students, I used to visit friends of mine that were at UT or at Southwest Texas State University in San Marcos. And back in the 70s, they used to call the schools down here Taco Tech, okay? Oh, where do you go to school? Oh, I'm going to school at A&I Kingsville. Oh, Taco Tech, okay? Because it's mostly Hispanics that go over here, So they labeled, that automatically showed me that I didn't belong in that area, So I wanted back, There's a lot of cultural security being around people that have the same experiences, and you feel welcomed and you feel comfortable. So that's one of the things that I resented, okay? That we were, as a region of the state, denied access to what everybody else in the rest of the state had, okay? A myriad of doctoral programs. You could become a lawyer, an engineer, a doctor, a banker, whatever. Down here, you end up being just a menial, blue-collar laborer for the most part. There's very little that is available for the people that stay here to reach their highest potential, okay, academically, educationally. So you have to leave the area, and I really don't like that. And I express that in a lot of the presentations that I give. I've given presentations on the lack of equal access to education here in South Texas based on the case of Lulac versus Richards here at the university and at various groups throughout the city, I'd rather give this presentation to people up in Austin who need to hear it, okay? More so than the folks that already know it down here,
So given your research on Lulac v. Richards and your experience teaching, do you think the South Texas Border Initiative was effective in its goal?
Well, it's satisfied the public, okay? But, like I said, first they were eager to simply give us their name, and it took about 30 years to finally start giving us money for programs. That border initiative that was originally passed was, I think, about $186 million to be spread between Kingsville, Corpus, Laredo, Brownsville, and Edinburgh, okay? So you end up with about $40 million each, okay? Which is nice and good. You can build a few buildings, but you can't create and maintain professional programs without additional funding, okay? And that South Texas Border Initiative originally was to span 10 years of funding, okay? And there was no guarantee that it was going to be reenacted again or reapplied again, So the original lawsuit wanted $10 billion over 10 years. That is $1 billion every year dedicated to the schools down in South Texas, okay? When UT and A&M saw that, they said, shit, I'm not paying that type of money, okay? So they just simply said, well, we'll pursue this South Texas Border Initiative. We'll give them 1% of what they're asking for, okay? And then periodically renew the funding, okay? So they just threw us a bone, and said, here, suck on this for a while and try not to sue us anymore, okay? So we're still, a backwater of education. We increased the number of doctoral programs probably to about 20 for all of South Texas, okay? But that still pales in comparison to the rest of the state, okay? And yet we're just as Texan as everybody else, okay? We're a citizen, we were born here, we contribute to taxes, and so forth. We shouldn't be treated unequally, okay?
So, what do you think can be done going forward to kind of fix these issues?
First off, the public needs to understand that simply being adopted by A&M and UT and now having your diplomas read, well, graduate of A&M Corpus Christi or University of Texas Brownsville, that in itself is not a benefit, okay? I mean, it looks good, but it doesn't give you any additional funding or programs. So the public needs to be informed of this. And not just the public here in South Texas, but like I said, the public in Austin, okay? And in College Station. They should realize that there has been this constant inequality for at least 100 years, okay? More so. More than that, actually, okay? And we deserve a medical school, and we deserve more than one medical school. We deserve a law school. We deserve all sorts of the same scale and scope of programs and types of programs that are outside of South Texas should be included down here as well, okay? And if they're unwilling to do that, we can go back to court, I think that's the only thing that forces them to pay attention. The threat of a lawsuit or an actual decision against you in a court of law, Other than that, they've always given us lip service, okay? UT is the ground zero for anti-affirmative action lawsuits, okay? The A&M Cadet Corps was segregated up until sued, okay? UT Law School was segregated up until they were sued, okay? So that's what forces people to understand. You have to take them to court and force a judge to have these people testify honestly, okay? So, yeah, that's what it takes, in my view.
So something I forgot to ask earlier,
Yeah.
kind of about your experience growing up. What languages were spoken, in your household and in schools?
Both English and language. English and Spanish, excuse me. My dad would call it Spanglish, okay? Others call it Tex-Mex, But I grew up speaking a mixture of both English and Spanish. My parents before me, well, not my parents, but my grandparents spoke Spanish only. My mother, who was educated, at least up to a high school diploma, spoke English very well. My father learned how to read and write on his own over the years because of work and going to church and reading the Bible and so forth. By the time I grew up, I was well versed in. I grew up reading comic books just like any other kid. Okay, I was a voracious reader. I read newspapers. I read the encyclopedia. I loved learning. Okay, and so yeah, I'm well versed in both English and Spanish. When I was in Europe, I tried. I was able to have some rudimentary conversations in German, French, and Italian. Okay, Germany because I was there for a few years, and Spanish and Italian because Spanish language is rooted into the Latin and Roman language as well. And so the time that I spent in Italy as well, I was able to communicate fairly well. And in Spain, Spanish is Spanish. They speak a pure version of it, but still we were able to communicate well. So being bilingual, I think, provides me an edge. Okay, you're not just bilingual in being able to voice, but to read and to understand and to think and to act and to accommodate and assimilate different concepts. It really expands a person's mind. Okay, and so being multilingual or bilingual is not a bad thing. It's an academically educational, enriching activity. And I have nephews and nieces that are monolingual, and they'll never know the ability to speak another language. They just pick up a couple of words and phrases, perhaps, but they're missing out, I think. But their parents raise them that way because they need to accommodate. They need to assimilate in order for them to not be treated lesser. Okay, you want to be qualified for a job, speak well, and be American. Basic attitude.
So, did anyone speak Spanish in school growing up?
Yeah, sure. We all did. All our friends. My friends as well. All my friends. Outside of class, we spoke Spanish. We spoke English and Spanish. We spoke, at times we get in trouble, but we used to have a great deal of fun communicating with each other, and a lot of times I also had white friends, okay, and I would always assure them, look, if I'm going to say anything that you don't understand, it's not to offend you or anything of the sort. It's just that I'm communicating with this person the best way I can, But there's always that you need to be polite enough to speak in the language that everyone understands, And I've understood that for quite some time.
How did language play a role during your military years?
Well, first off, the way I look. When I was serving in Alabama, northern Alabama, a lot of the locals over there thought I was Iranian, okay? This is during the Iranian hostage situation that was going on when Reagan was first elected. And so they looked down on me, what kind of, are you a Middle Eastern Iranian or what? You know, no, man, I'm a Mexican. You know, I tell them, you know, people understand that, being bilingual gives you a better opportunity to communicate with a different, diverse group of people. One time, and this is simply an example, this friend of mine named Rodney Mitchell, okay, his grandfather was Billy Mitchell of the U.S. Navy, the first man to fly off an aircraft carrier. He was from Alaska, okay? And I came from South Texas. Alaska is a very mountainous area. South Texas is very flat and easy to drive on. We took a trip around Europe one day, and when we were there, and we ended up at a bar in Geneva, Switzerland. And we wanted to buy some beer because we were camping out in the mountains, and we went into town to buy some beer to take back to our campground, and there's sort of an anti-American strain in Europe all the time, okay? They think we're arrogant, not necessarily individually, but our policies, our politics, okay? We push people over, we push people around, we impose ourselves on them. And so Rodney said, I'm going to the bar and asked the bartender if we can buy some beers. And he went and he spoke English to the bartender, and they made as though they didn't understand it. We don't speak English here. And they just blew him off. He came back to the table where I was at, and I said, well, let me try. And I went over to the bar, and I spoke in Spanish, and they welcomed me and all this type of stuff. This is in Geneva, which is primarily German and Swiss, but it's multilingual. Europeans speak on the base. On the average, I'd say 3, 4, 5 languages. Okay, and so they accept that culture. When I spoke Spanish to them, they were very accepting, and they sold me what they wouldn't sell to the English-speaking American. It opens doors, and it helps me understand and interpret things better. If I were just, as opposed to being monolingual, So, and I've always been comfortable speaking a combination of both English and Spanish. It's very soothing. That's the way I grew up.
So,
as a matter, just another thing, I use a lot of Spanish in class when identifying landmarks, rivers, natural features, when communicating Latin phrases like habeas corpus, ex post facto, all these things that you read in politics, the voir dire, the venire, amicus brief, things of this sort. You read a lot of Latin. Spanish gives you the ability to understand the root of the meaning, okay? Because it's Latin, and Spanish comes from that language as well. And so it gives me a lot of insight. I'm able to tell students very detailed and clear descriptions of what terms mean. And as far as historical places, like the Alamo, I mentioned earlier, in English, it's a cottonwood tree, okay? And yet most students would never know that, unless you bring it up. And the Nueces River, is based on the fact that it was lined by pecan trees, okay? The Padre Island is named after a Catholic priest. It's not Party Island, okay, as a lot of folks say. And San Antonio de Bejar, okay, it's not Bexar County, it's Bejar County. And I explained to them that that's a Spanish surname of a member of the royal court and so forth, And so it gives them better understanding of the connection between Spanish Texas and white Texas, Anglo Texas. That way we're not left out, of the historical narrative. I always try to ensure that, give students, and a lot of students don't like it, I'll see white students go, oh, do I have to learn this and all this type of shit, I tell them, hey man, you don't have to if you don't want to, but I just want you to understand, you folks weren't the first ones here, there have been a lot of different groups that have existed here, and Texas, what the society we have today is the culmination of all these different forces and all these different factors, So it helps understand a lot of the history, and it helps my teaching as well.
I think I've only got one more question, then we'll be finished up, and it's one I forgot when we were talking about your early life again. What kind of role did religion play in your household?
It was a very strong role. I was baptized into the Catholic Church. I know I have a set of godfather and godmother of baptism. Then I was confirmed into the Catholic Church at 7 years old. You're baptized at birth, then confirmed at about 6 years old, and you have another set of parents as well. And I went through Catholic school. I went to Catholic school up until the 2nd grade. Then from there, I went to catechism after school until I graduated. During that time, in the earliest years when I was still in Catholic school, I was an altar boy, okay? And that was in San Diego. But I have a deep belief in Jesus and God, okay? In recent years, since the passing of my brother and my sister and my mother and quite a few folks and so forth, I've sort of slacked off going to church, but I've never slacked off in believing and praying, and a belief in prayer, okay? Excuse me. I was with my sister when her last rites were given, okay? I held hands with her, my mother, and the Catholic priest that administered the last rites for my sister. And at that time, as the prayer was being said, I could feel this energy flowing, a physical energy flowing through my arms, the center of my body, all of us, that I couldn't explain, and I just felt that it was the effect of the prayer and the spirit and the fact that we were all together holding hands and stuff. That was one time in history in my entire life that something happened that I couldn't understand, but I attributed to my faith, okay? And then when my uncle died, my mother's brother, he died at the Audemars Hospital in San Antonio. I was there the moment he was on a respirator and a heartbeat monitor, and the moment, that his heart stopped beating and he flatlined, there was a dozen roses sitting right by his bed, brilliant red roses that had been brought to him that morning by his daughter, and immediately upon him taking his last breath, they wilted and turned black, okay? Right in front of my eyes, and right in front of my aunt's eyes and my cousin's eyes. And we looked at him and said, look at the flowers. And they just turned black and wilted right in front of us. And we couldn't understand it, and we just asked each other what happened, and my aunt said his soul took him with him, I mean, it was just like as though she had seen it before, but she understood that that's what it was. And I can't describe it any other way myself. I had no explanation whatsoever other than his soul, his spirit, took those flowers with him as he left. Because, it's very easy to discount things as, well, there's a a natural explanation for it, scientific explanation. But when you're experiencing a traumatic event like the death of your brother or sister or your loved one, it really changes it opens up your mind to the possibility that there's more than just a scientific explanation for everything. There's a spiritual world that is probably beyond, explanation through science. So, I'm a firm believer, and I've had events like that happen to me that I couldn't understand or I couldn't explain, but I came to understand as being that it's a mystery, that you can't explain, and you just chalk it up as being part of that's why people believe in religion. It gives them strength at times when you need it the most. And every now and then I'm overwhelmed by grief, at the loss of my father, my mother, my younger brother, my sister, the suffering they went through. And I'll end up praying, and thinking about Jesus and God as a way of coping with the loss,
I think that's everything for me. Is there anything else that you can think of that you wanted to talk about that I didn't ask about?
I don't believe so, but I brought a lot of materials to be scanned, and there's going to be a good record of this. Will I be? Oh, you said there was going to be a CD sent to me?
Yes, we'll give you a DVD of.
Or DVD?
Yeah.
When this is placed in the archives, in the library archives of Voces, will I be able to access it?
Yes.
Will I be given a link to it?
Yes, I can absolutely
Excellent.
send you one once we've processed everything.
And I think Maggie wanted my brother's address because he lives in McAllen, and I understand you guys are going out there sometime, or at least maybe another group.
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah. And so before I leave, I want to make sure I give it to her as well. And I really appreciate you listening. That's great.
You've been a great subject.
Well, that's wonderful.